So help me God. So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God. So help me God.
In 2017, over 70 million persons, or 22% of the United States population, identified as part of the Roman Catholic Church. Hello, my name is Rob Lee, and this is So Help Me Pod, a podcast that explores the theologies of the American presidency. Historically speaking, there have been great migrations of Roman Catholic people dating farther back than our nation's infancy, than our nation was even a nation. Yet despite these realities and the vast influence that many Roman Catholics have on our society today, there have been only two Roman Catholic United States presidents, John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., the current occupant of the White House. When Kennedy ran in the 60s, he had to answer as to if he would take orders from the Bishop of Rome. And today, the current president is always, it seems, a stone's throw away from being denied the sacrament of Holy Communion for his progressive views on abortion and gay marriage. The relationship between the presidency and a Christian branch of the faith has rarely been so fraught with the potential for promise, but also disaster. Today, to help make sense of it all, I invited my friend, Father James Martin, to discuss the landscape of Roman Catholicism from where he sees it. Jim is a Jesuit priest, an editor at American Magazine, and a prolific author. Shameless plug, his newest book is coming out later this year and is titled Come Forth, The Promise of Jesus' Greatest Miracle, and is being published by Harper Collins. Also, and really importantly, Father Martin was named directly by His Holiness Pope Francis to the Synod on Synodality, a much-anticipated conference of Catholic leaders akin to the Second Vatican Council. It will seek to give voice to the changing landscape of Catholicism, its surroundings, and its people. But for now, Jim joined me on this lowly podcast for a conversation on the place in it all that Roman Catholicism has in relationship to the American presidency. And I am so grateful for him, his leadership, all he's doing, all the amazing things he's doing, but most of all, I am grateful for his friendship and for his wisdom. Let's listen in. Father James Martin, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
For those who might be not as familiar with the intricacies of the Catholic faith and life in the United States, could you perhaps give us an elevator speech primer on the history of Roman Catholicism in the United States?
Oh my gosh. The history of Roman Catholicism in the United States. Well, gosh. We came over very early, I think in the 17th century. I think the name of the boat was the Ark and the Dove, which carried some Jesuit priests. Generally speaking, the Catholics focused on Maryland, I think, and then sort of fanned out from there. We started archdioceses or dioceses in Baltimore first, New York, Philadelphia, mainly East Coast cities. There was a huge influx of Irish Catholic immigrants, I guess in the late 1800s mainly, which really swelled our ranks, and that's why still so many Catholic priests and sisters and whatnot are Irish. And then I think, there was a lot of anti-Catholicism. There was, burning convents and burning churches and things like that, sort of throughout. I mean, obviously, this is a largely Protestant country in terms of its culture, and certainly, in terms of its religiosity. There was always some suspicion, papists and, foreign powers and things like that. But I think, gradually we got more and more integrated. And then, the first Catholic president, 1960, John F. Kennedy, that was a big turning point. The Second Vatican Council made it easier for us to work with other religions, so that helped a bit. And I think for the most part, Catholics are pretty much, I would say, 90%, 95% mainstreamed. We have President Biden, who's a Catholic president. I don't think that was really held against him in any way. And there are pockets of anti-Catholicism still. You don't see, a whole lot of it, but there's still some. I'm in the media and some sort of ultra conservative, ultra kind of evangelical places that still talk about, the evil Pope and things like that. But yeah, so it went from us being one of many to in the beginning to some pushback to I would think complete enculturation. So that's a thumbnail sketch. If I can do, I'm not an historian, so forgive me if I've got any of that stuff wrong.
Well,
Anyway, so
yeah. So at last check, 22%, according to some studies of the country, at least have some sense of Roman Catholicism in them. That we don't even know what that means. What does it mean to be Roman Catholic? Is sometimes a broad definition when you're asking people on a survey. And it took the election of our nation's 35th president, John F. Kennedy, in 1960 to become our nation's first Roman Catholic president. At the time of his election to the presidency, there was some anti-Catholic hysteria surrounding his faith. People were skeptical. Would this president be answering to the Pope? Which was always an interesting question to research, right? Like, what does that mean? What was the Pope's agenda in the 1960s? And of course, with the Second Vatican Council, the 1960s were a busy year for Roman Catholics. So tell me about anti-Catholic sentiment insofar as you were able in this country, and what it does not only to the faith but also to people, and what you've heard or seen or experienced.
Sure. Well, I think President Kennedy had to address that by going in front of a group of Protestant pastors, I think in Texas somewhere, in Houston or Dallas, and made basically said the Pope is not telling me what to do. So there's always been a suspicion. One of the main reasons is because the founding fathers, were products of the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment was in large part, not only kind of focusing on science, but also focusing its opposition to the church and the Catholic Church, that is. And so they came from the founding fathers came from I would say, a fairly anti-Catholic worldview. There's a quote from John Adams about how terrible the Jesuits are too. And there's a lot of reasons why there would be anti-Catholicism in the United States beyond that. Beyond the sort of religious reasons, but there was seen as the Vatican is seen as a foreign power. The Latin Mass was seen as bizarre. There's a certain otherness about Catholicism. They're just not Protestants, and so the same with anti-Semitism. And in the 1850s, I think, with the Know Nothing Party and these sort of so-called swarms of Irish immigrants that were supposedly taking over, we see the same kind of rhetoric with migrants today. There was a fear that Catholics would infiltrate, and because their numbers would dominate political systems. And I think the main focus is that the Pope tells us what to do, which is pretty. If you see how people respond to the Pope today, even within the Catholic Church, you see how kind of crazy that is. I think it's pretty subtle, though. You see it particularly in the media. And so it's okay to make fun of priests and sisters and brothers. And the priest is either going to be a pedophile if you see him on TV or the movies, or sister's going to be an idiot. Or you often see, I find this a lot of times, even like in the New York Times, someone's described as, they come from a devout Catholic family. And that doesn't usually, that's not good. That usually means that they're supposed to be kind of closed-minded or something like that. And so I think because you're living in a largely Protestant culture, and it changes, in different parts of the country. I think, as you probably know, in the South, it's a lot more, virulent than it would be in the Northeast, where Catholics are kind of everywhere. So it's seen as other, it's seen as different, it's seen as, weird, exotic, foreign. And so it's still there. It's, you do see it a lot. As I said, in popular culture, and sometimes you see it a lot in sort of evangelical or fundamentalist, comments about Catholics, and certainly the sex abuse crisis has played into all that, right? Catholics they're all pedophiles, they're all child abusers, they're all disgusting. Also, celibacy is seen as weird, right? So there's lots of there's lots of parts of the church that are seen as bizarre, foreign, weird, and that makes people frightened, and that leads to anti-Catholicism.
It is interesting to see the sentiments. Okay, and it may be my microphone coming on, because I think I've been muting myself, and when I come on, and that's when we've been getting trouble. So we can work that out.
Oh, okay.
But I can hear
Okay.
you just fine. So
All right, cool.
yeah. So our current president, Joe Biden, is a faithful and practicing Roman Catholic person. There's actually, as we've talked about, as you've mentioned, the media has made a lot of that in some ways, whether it was, I remember back when he was vice president, there was considerable hubbub about him having the ashes on his head during Ash Wednesday, and how that was somehow a very foreign thing when I myself, even as a Protestant, had ashes on my head every Ash Wednesday. So it's just interesting how that plays out. But with President Biden, there's been considerable debate over whether the president should be denied communion because of his views on abortion or gay marriage or whatever that are considered in some views contrary to Catholic Church teaching. I'm not going to ask you to weigh in on those issues, that we don't have enough time for that. But I am curious about the idea of denying communion to an active parishioner on this basis. Is that normal? I mean, I know that's not normal, but how does that work? Because as someone who is in a church that it has an open table, that's foreign to me, and I'd like to understand it better, not in a critique way, but just in praxis and how that plays out.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, and it's foreign to most Catholics. I mean, we were taught in seminary that if someone comes up to communion, you give them communion. I mean, because one of the things is you have no idea if they've been to confession 5 minutes beforehand. And obviously communion is supposed to also include that you're in communion with the church, right? So it's communion, it's a sacrament. So there is the expectation that you are in communion with the church, so that you're Catholic in good standing, you're in a state of grace, but you have no idea who's coming up in the communion line and what they've done. And even if President Biden comes up in the communion line, he might have gone to confession 5 minutes beforehand. I'm not going to sort of turn somebody away. The other problem with that is that it's very selective. I mean, do we deny communion to people who are using birth control? I mean, that's 80% of Catholic married couples. Are we going to deny communion to 80% of Catholic married couples? So it's very selective, and it's usually only done. I mean, it's usually only talked about with politicians. So, I mean, as far as I can see, it's a kind of weaponization of the Eucharist, which I totally disagree with. So I don't think, if someone presents themselves for communion, you should give them communion, again, because you have no idea what's going on in their heart. But it's foreign. Like, for example, you don't go to maybe this is helpful for non-Catholics. You don't go to a parish every week and see, certain people being turned away. Everyone gets communion. So I went to Mass yesterday at my local church next door, and everyone who stood up and went to the altar got communion. So you don't say, "Oh, you're not getting it. You're not getting it." I mean, that's very strange. That would be very strange in a parish. So it's very unusual.
It is interesting, though. I think there's been a lot of media kind of hype about that contributes to the conversation, maybe in a not so healthy way, as we've been talking about. Well, I have one last question for you. Part of my research, I want it to be fun and I want it to be interesting for people who are participating with me. We're asking all of our experts, our people who have spoken with me about their respective denominations, about what their denominations espouse in their history, a little bit as quickly as we can. We're asking all our experts this question, so I hope you'll indulge me. Who is your favorite president or your most intriguing president to you, and why? We're not asking you to endorse a candidate or endorse a president. But just curious about your favorite and why they are most intriguing to you.
That's an interesting question. President of the United States?
Yes.
Oh, what an interesting question. I'm a big fan of FDR. I'm a big fan of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I find him fascinating. I've read him like a billion books about Franklin Roosevelt. I think the way he overcame polio is fascinating. I think his kind of optimistic attitude is fascinating. I think the fact that he's so opaque is really interesting. He was kind of a mystery to people who even knew him. I just find the polio is just fascinating to me. I mean, in the sense that he overcame that, and was a kind of from what from what I've read, was a bit, I don't want to say shallow, but a bit of a kind of bon vivant when he was young, and sort of rich and privileged, and that was a real crucible for him. And I was reading a book recently that talked about, his famous "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." A lot of that comes from his own background, comes from his own. I mean, he's taken it apparently from a couple sources, but the idea that that he could kind of surmount things, I find fascinating, and that also just the fact that no one really, wasn't talked about back then, right? I mean, he as he appeared in public, on the arms of his sons or aides or stuff, and people thought he had a problem, like he had a problem walking or he was in a wheel, but they really never averted to it. And there's only we only have a few videos where he's seen kind of walking. So I find FDR just, and then of course, the Depression and World War II, I find those topics really interesting. I would say also, so he's I find the most interesting. I also find George Washington, I mean, this is a little banal, but I find George Washington very interesting. I read a lot about him. John Adams, of course, the David McCullough book, Harry Truman. But yeah, FDR, I really, yeah, I just find him so kind of mysterious and inspiring and kind of fun too. I mean, he was funny. One of my favorite talks, I'm sure you've heard it, which I think is just great. I think of this all the time when people are posing me. He talked about, I think it was during the 1936 presidential election, where he has that great speech where you probably know this, where he says, never have there been so many people from financial interests, banking, whatnot, united in their hatred against me. Do you know that speech? And he says, what did he say? Never have they been so united in their hatred against me. I welcome their hatred. I just think that is one of the best rhetorical. I don't think I've ever heard something that punchy and jujitsu, and it's just
Well,
great.
and with
And
your banking background too, that's kind of interesting too.
I know.
So, yeah, it is interesting. There's this wonderful book about being a Christian and a Democrat. That's one of FDR's famous lines when they asked him about his faith. He says, "I'm a Christian and I'm a Democrat," and that was his kind of his faith that he espoused. So, so interesting. So, but Father James Martin, thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Good to be with you, my friend. Good luck with the degree.
Thank you. You've been listening to So Help Me Pod, a podcast of Beloved Journal in conjunction with Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. The podcast is offered in partial completion of the Doctor of Ministry degree for the Reverend Robert W. Lee. All opinions and insights offered are solely owned by that of those who offered them and do not reflect the views of stakeholders in the project. There have been 45 men and 46 presidential administrations, all of them unique. Some of them have been more interesting than others, some of them more terrifying than others. All have been part of the grand expression of democracy on the North American continent and part of the wider conversation of self-governance in the world. These men have failed profoundly, and we have failed profoundly in following their leadership along with our own sometimes antiquated and backwards ways of viewing and acting in the world. That said, this form of leadership is unlike few other, and the greatest gift we have has been given in the ways in which the American experiment continues to prosper despite our terrible misgivings. We are better off because of these men, and we are forever in their debt. For more information, visit www.roblee4.com/presidents.